Hi there. Today I'd like to show you how I carve fins. And the fins are for this little fellow. In fact, they are on here now, so the clip that you will see later on is how I made these pelvic fins for this one. And it's a pretty big asp. But first I'd like to talk a little bit about reference, because I use all kinds of reference when I carve. I mean, you see all these pictures on the wall, and I have cast reference, cast heads, this is not for the asp, and cast bodies, like this asp body, which is of a little bit smaller asp. You can see that I used it for making the scales on the big fella. I have marked different areas where the scales are different, and I have also used it for facial features reference when I made the details on the head. And of course I use reference when I carve fins too. So I have a lot of cast fins of different types from the time when I used to cast fish, and these fins I use to look at details and look at how they look and so on. It's very important, I think, to have reference when you carve, because if you don't have reference, things go far away from the way they look in reality, and you have to have something to look at all the time. This approach to carving that I will show you is something that I came up with when I was casting fish. I was molding and casting fish before, and in the beginning when I made fins, I used to make one-sided, maybe you can see here, one-sided casts of the fin. I hadn't come up with a way to make them thin enough as two-sided fins, so I made one side, the show side, as a cast, and then I used to carve in the details on the other side. And that way I, of course, could check all the time that what I did on this side would be something similar to what I could see on that side. So this was, you might say, my first carving exercises, and after a while I found that I could carve the details on the other side of the fin, so that you could more or less not see which side was carved and which side was not in the painted fin. And that was, of course, a good confidence booster when I started thinking about going into proper carving instead of casting my fish. So first we will talk about reference, and I will show you a few clips on reference fins, and talk a little bit about how fin structure really is, because I feel that very often when people carve, they carve something that they have in their head. They don't really look at how things look. They have an idea in their head of how it is supposed to look or how it is constructed, and they carve that instead, and that makes it look, in my opinion, very carved. It looks artificial, unnatural, and I want to make fish that look like real fish, not like something artificial. And my approach, I would say, is the ambition to make something that looks like what you really see in a fin. So let's one more thing. I'd like to talk a little bit about fin action too. You can see, if you look like this, you can see that there are a lot of different angles. Like this pelvic is going down, and this pelvic is going out, and this pectoral is going up. And this is because this fish is in a, it's doing a right turn. it's going right with its tail and pushing on, and then it's going into a right turn. And when fish go into right turns, I found by studying video clips, they often put down the pelvic that is out in the curve as a rudder, I think. Many different species do that. And also they steer with their pectorals. So that is something that should be considered when you decide how you are going to make the fins on the Fishcarve. And you should also consider animation, bends in the fin. Consider what the water pressure will do to a fin that is pushed down like this in an outer turn. It will press the outer softer parts of the fin in under the fish, and that is it's good to get that consistent with the action of the fish, because that way you will make something that looks alive instead of make something that looks dead. Okay, that's about it, I think. Let's try and start carving. Okay, so looking at a little reference is the plan now. And let's start with the pelvic of an asp, which is what we're going to carve later on. If you look at this one, have a look here, you can see that the feathering, the striations in the feathering are of course branching out, and you will see that they become more and more. You see that on this one, but you can't see the different specific branches one by one, as many people carve them in a fin. Rather, you see that there are quite a few striations here close to the base, and then they are becoming more and more and more and more, and it's a very fine pattern, which is not always consistent, because there are different features to the tissue that interrupt, like for example folds. Here's a little bit of damage that the fish has on its fin, I think. See, yeah, here's a fold. There are things happening here that you can't really tell how the branchings go, but you know, you can see there are branchings, but you can't really see everyone each by themselves. Here you see the same injury as was on the other side, I think. No, that's that one. Anyway, you can also see that the depressions between the fin rays have this elongated, like teardrop shape, maybe willow leaf shape is a better word. And you can see that they aren't perfectly clean either. There are things happening in them too, like a little bit of folding, a little bit of stretching, and so on. So there has to be something happening inside these depressions too. You will also see that the edge tapers down, and that the fin edge becomes paper thin somewhere around here. And if you look here, these depressions don't go out into that area, but rather the branching, the feathering out of the fin rays come together in that area. The base of the fin is thick. There is a taper on the back edge too, rear edge, and the base of the fin is quite thick, tapering down towards this thin area. Let's look at, here's a pectoral from the same fish, an asp. And if you look more, you see the same features. You have the depression. It's narrower on the pectoral. There are more fin rays. You have these slight and dense striations, which start as one or two at the base of the fin and then going out and becoming very many out here. And you have this feature, the fin rays, the rear fin rays have a tendency to curve forward. That is a very common feature in a pectoral fin also, that you will see on many other fish. You have more or less the same things in a salmonid fin. You have the striations, you have narrow depressions. This is of course a pectoral fin. You have this tendency to curve forward of the fin rays. So it's about the same thing. You have this undivided spiny ray up front. I mean, if you look closer, you even have two spiny rays up front. It's a different fin, but it has about the same characteristics as the asp fin. And then we have two fins from a perch here. This is the pectoral and this is the pelvic. And you can see that there is pretty much the same pattern here. Different but the same. You have the depressions, you have the very fine striations on the fin rays, the feathering out. You even have a spiny ray here too. And you have this tendency to curve forward a little. So more or less the same, but in a different way, of course. And if you look at the pelvic, also these striations, also this, they go together, folds and structure mask off the forkings, so you can't really see each forking of the feathering of the fin ray, but you can see that it's there because there are few here and very many here. You have this depression, which is pretty clear on a perch pelvic, and the spiny ray. So there is a pattern that reoccurs in many different fins, not all of course, but in many. And the way I will show you how to carve fins you can use for many different species. Of course you have to look at the reference and see how to do it, but generally it's very useful. So what we have to do when we carve this pattern is create these striations and these depressions and some structure in the depressions too. And then these striations shouldn't be too obvious and too wide. They need to be a set of very many fine striations, more and more coming out to the edge here. And you will not have to bother about making them very clear, because they go into each other, and when you look at it, you really don't see, you can't follow one for very long before it disappears into another. And that's the way we are going to carve the pattern on the fin. Okay, so time to start carving, and I have of course the reference cast of the fin that we talked about, and I have the two blocks of wood that I will carve into fins, and each block is glued together from two pieces of wood with the grain going
diagonally out towards the corners for strength, so that there will be no grain cutting across the corners where fin can break. And the first thing is to draw up the contour of the fin. I start by marking the line where the fin is going to go against the body. Now I go on to draw up the animation that we talked about before. You can imagine the bending according to how water presses on the fin you have in mind, and also that the inner parts of the fin and the front edge is stiffer, so it bends less, while the center part of the outer edge and the rear edge is bending more. This animation is also helping to create the impression of a thin fin. And some people really overdo it with undulations like S shapes and so on. But keep it simple, because no fin is really undulating in an S form. I also draw up the tab that is going into the body, so that I get the right angle. You should notice how I use my little finger as a support prop all the time, touching either the piece I'm working on or something else that is solid. That's a really good idea to do, because it helps a lot with precision and gives you much more control. Right now, it's necessary to mark the contact points between fin and the body again, because they are being erased by the carving. And now we need to check the reference again. We talked about how the fin tapers down to a really thin outer edge. And I mark the points where this area begins on both sides. You might wonder why I need such a thick piece of wood to create such a thin fin. But the thickness makes it possible to animate the fin from one side of the wood to the other, and it gives you space to create action. You will need the animations to create the impression of thinness in the fin, but don't overdo. Too much will look unnatural, so keep it simple and discreet. I'm taking down the fin surface towards the outer edge. It's good to have a continuous flow of shapes throughout the fin. So if the outer edge goes down, that dip needs to be brought in over the fin and blended with the other shapes. Doing some final small adjustments, the corners and edges. And we're ready to start sanding. If you think this fin doesn't really look the same as what you saw just a moment ago, that's quite true. This is the other fin. The film sequence of the sanding process came better on this fin than on the other, but it's the same process. It's an old saying among woodworkers that the hand sees more than the eye. And I agree completely about that. I use my fingers all the time to check lines and shapes. And now it's time to start marking the fin ray pattern. And I actually mark the dips between the fin rays rather than the fin rays themselves. If you look at the reference, you will see that there are 3 rays at the rear edge of the fin that are a little bit narrower than the other fin rays, and I start by marking them off. And since I carve a fin that is slightly narrower or less spread than the reference fin, I also mark them a little bit narrower. And then I also mark the spiny fin ray that we talked about earlier, that is at the front edge of the fin. When you've done that, you can see that there are 5 more fin rays in between these that we have already marked. And I just eyeball them in, roughly dividing the space between what I have already marked into 5 equal parts. And it helps a lot to draw a line to do that. And when that's done, you just have to connect the dots to get your depressions. I also mark off the outer edge area that we talked about before, where the fin is really thin. And here there will be no real depressions, but the feathering of the fin rays will come together. And when that's done, we're ready to start carving the pattern. There will be quite a bit of repetition here. I mean, I have 9 fin rays to do exactly the same thing to. So there will be some fast forwarding and some jumps between the places where I need to comment. And I start off by marking up the depressions with a diamond cylinder and deepening them so I get the right depth. A cylinder is actually quite perfect to do this kind of work because the more I turn it sideways, the wider the track gets, and that way I can vary the width of the track and really create that willow leaf shape that we talked about before. I said that the depressions would stop at the line out at the outer edge where the fin gets really thin. And now you see me go past that line with a cylinder, so you might think I'm making a mistake, but I'm doing very shallow markings there that will become just slight undulations in the surface. Let's stop for a moment and look at the result. And you can see that this willow shape is what I have created in the wood. The pattern is a bit rough and I need to round it off, and I do that with a round stone. Just leveling the depressions down, rounding all the edges, and smoothing off the undulations in the outer edge area. And here's a little thing that might come in handy. If you need a really sharp stone, as I need now, you can hone it down or sharpen it with a diamond file. An ordinary file won't work because stone will wear it down, but a diamond file works fine. Now we're going to create that striation pattern that we saw in the reference. I start with a deeper basic pattern, doing a few long strokes from the base all the way out to the edge. Then adding more and more grooves in between those from maybe halfway out. And even more and more as I come closer to the edge. Finally going over the edge with lots and lots of short strokes to create that thin, feathery effect. Then it's time for the second, lighter striation pattern that requires an even sharper, smaller stone and higher speed. I do this very lightly, randomly, almost just softening up the rougher basic striation pattern. Lots and lots of strokes all over the thin surface and the outer edge. And as a final step, I go over the entire surface with a steel brush at low speed. This removes lint, dust, small wood particles and roughness and gives the surface a final softening. Going into shaping the second side, much of what I do will of course be the same as on the first side. So I will make some fast forwards and jumps here too, and stop at the places where I need to comment. Much of the difference here is to make the fin appear thin without really being very thin. And the same as on the first side, I check the reference and I mark off the spots where the outer edge of the fin becomes really thin. Just as before, the hand sees more than the eye, and I check the thickness of the material frequently by pinching it between my thumb and forefinger. The aim is to create a really thin fin edge, but just inside it there should be a material thickness of maybe a millimeter or more, which is plenty. Another good thing to achieve that fin appearance is to make sure that the two sides of the fin correspond with each other. I mean that if one side is convex going out, the other side of the fin should be concave going in that place. In the middle area, the fin doesn't really have to be that thin. You just make sure that you have the animation there and that both sides of the fin correspond with each other. You can get away with quite a bit of thickness. I keep looking at the fin over the edge like this while I carve and checking with my fingers at the same time. That way I keep track of the thickness and at the same time I can see how the fin appears to the eye. And that's the way it goes on. I just keep taking away small amounts of wood, carefully thinning it down to the thickness that I want, checking thickness with my fingers and looking at how it appears at the same time, thinning down edges and just trying to achieve that thin look without losing too much material so that there will be something to make fin rays in later on. By making the outer edge of the fin really sharply thin, you make it possible to create the softness appearance with those striations later on. But just a little inside it, there should be more material. And now I really think you can see that the slight animation that I gave the fin was absolutely quite enough to create that thin appearance that I want, and still have enough material to create the fin race. Marking the fin ray pattern on the second side is of course exactly the same procedure as on the first side. Some recommend that you alter the patterns so that the highs on one side correspond with the lows on the other side, but I think that's a bad idea because real fins don't look that way, and I think I have enough material to pull it off anyway. Much of what is happening here you already know because you have seen it in detail on the first side, so this part will be a pretty quick one. Anyway, there are a few things that I need to point out about the second side, so there will be one or two stops. Here is a good sequence where you can see quite well how I make the first striation pattern. Making a few long strokes all the way from the base and out, and then shorter in between, filling out the gaps all the way out to the edge. And here I'm creating the impression of a soft fin edge with many short strokes. And it's here that it's important that the edge is, as I said, sharply thin, and that we made these strokes on the other side of the fin too. And of course, the same with the second set of striations, which is what really finalizes the impression of a soft edge.